Good morning, everyone. Thanks for getting up so early and coming here to see me. My name's Jez Humble. I work for ThoughtWorks. We build custom software. We have tools for building software, and we do consulting around software as well. So this talk is something that I've been thinking about for a while, sparked by a conversation I had with an architect at a tech company you've all heard of. And he pinged me and said, "We're looking to hire the next John Allsport. Do you know who that person is?" And no, I have no idea who that person is. But also I thought, here's a tech company that's really a pretty amazing tech company. Why is that person not coming from within that tech company? That's actually a sign, in my opinion, that something's wrong with that company, that they're not able to actually grow those people from inside it. And so, hence the title of the talk, Stop Hiring DevOps Experts and Start Growing Them. And the other phenomenon which I'm sure you've all experienced is this thing about hiring DevOps. Here's a blog post from earlier this year about, from a recruitment company about how to hire DevOps. DevOps is the latest big trend in hiring. Everyone's talking about DevOps, and everyone wants them. And so the dirty secret is kind of the interesting bit, right? Here's the confusing part. There's no such thing as a DevOps. You'll have a damn hard time finding someone whose business card just says DevOps. This is no longer true, of course. in the intervening 8 months, everyone in the world has DevOps on their LinkedIn profile, and everyone's getting spammed for DevOps, which is the other reason for the title of this talk. And the point that he makes, which I'm sure you're all aware of, what you're actually looking for is a developer with some experience and knowledge as a sysadmin, or possibly a sysadmin with some experience and knowledge as a programmer. So hands up in this audience if you're as comfortable with Bash or Puppet as you are with Clojure or Java or Ruby and OOP. Okay, so that's a ton of you, right? And I'm sure 5 years ago, there would have been much less of a ton of you. So this is something that has actually changed in the last few years, and it's reflective of the fact that the game has changed. This is a picture that I stole from Andrew Schaefer, who did a talk called There's No Talent Shortage, which covers a similar ground to the talk that I'm giving now. And what he points out is that continuous delivery, the ability to deliver frequently and fast and go from idea to measurable customer outcome is actually a competitive advantage now for lots of companies. The ability to do this, to go fast, to test out new ideas, to develop customers, the lean startup, all these ideas are premised on the ability to go from idea to production and measurement as fast as you possibly can. And so all these companies want to follow the likes of Amazon and Google and Facebook and the companies that are able to do this really effectively, Etsy and so forth, and they want that. So how do they get that? Well, they need to hire it, and that's the reaction of a lot of people. Well, we need to hire people who know how to do this, and that's going to enable us to do it. And I think fundamentally, this is the wrong approach, and the reason is culture. And people who talk about DevOps, culture is a big thing, but what do we actually mean by culture? There's this book by William Schneider called The Re-Engineering Alternative, which is not a new book. It came out in 1994, but this guy is a management consultant, and like organ management consultancy has a quadrant diagram, very important for management consultants. And so he's created this diagram around cultures. So on one axis is whether the culture is people-oriented or company-oriented. On the other axis is whether it's possibility-oriented or reality-oriented. And this diagram is by a guy called Michael Sahota, who wrote a really good ebook that the URI is there on the bottom right, talking about agile and culture. If you look at the history of programming and computers and operations, ops in particular is up in the top right. And the reason for that is the forces that act on operations people. Operations is concerned with predictability, with stability, with security. And this is a little tag cloud that Michael Sahota came up with based on the kind of words that you find in this book for the different cultures. But those are the things that ops care about. So it makes sense as to why they're up there in the top right. And the other thing that the other point this guy makes is that these cultures are premised on different communities and different institutions. So the control culture, the prototype of that is the military. Who here has read The Phoenix Project by Gene Kim? Okay, lots of you. So if you haven't, you should. But one of the things that amuses me about that book is that so many of the characters are ex-military. There's all these ex-military people in the book. And that kind of makes sense when you think about it, because the same culture that you need to achieve these goals in operations is the prototype culture of that is the military. So it makes sense that those people find a home in operations because they have the similar kind of goals. And I think what's interesting for me is that development originally was up there in the top right-hand corner. The first conference on software engineering in the 60s was sponsored by NATO. And the job of that conference was to be able to create systems of people to build military software systems. And so developers were up there. This idea of extensive forward planning, the ability to execute on the plan, and architect up front, and then this whole waterfall methodology where the developers just code it, that was up there in the top right. And what happened, I think, in the 70s and the 80s is we gradually moved away from that. And Agile, which, even though Agile, the name was kind of coined in the 2000s, the concept goes way before that. People were doing kind of Agile stuff. It's fair to say that these guys were not military guys, all right? So, even from the Unix days, people were in other areas. Collaboration is talked about by DevOps people. DevOps people talk a lot about collaboration. And I think what happened is development moved to other places in this quadrant diagram, but ops didn't. And so I think what you're seeing now is, with companies like Etsy and Amazon and so forth, ops is actually moving away from this. Ops is moving into these other areas too. And I think what DevOps is about is DevOps came into being because there was a clash between development culture, which was not in the top right, and operations culture, which was. And what we're seeing as a result of that is DevOps is making operations move from control into other areas of the quadrant diagram. But I think people focus a lot on collaboration. People focus on competence. I think what's missing in the conversation, and this is why this quadrant diagram I think is really interesting, is this idea of cultivation, of growing people. The game has changed, and the game is about learning new things. Our field is accelerating. In the last 10 years, we've seen the emergence of whole new fields. Big data has gone mainstream. Mobile has gone mainstream. These are huge fields that require whole new approaches to software development and to operations and to the way we build and grow and run services. And so the only way to keep up with that is if the organizations we build are focused on growing the people to be able to learn how to actually do these things. So how do we actually do that? I think the important thing is, if your answer to that is we're going to hire people, A, that's not going to scale because a lot of people don't have these skills, but also it's just not going to work because what you're trying to do is, in order to create an organization that's capable of doing this, you're going to need to move into the bottom left. And the dirty secret is you can't hire in cultural change. What happens if you try and hire in cultural change is, the person who's got all these skills is going to come into this organization, which is not a cultivation culture. And who's done that? Who's gone to work in a large organization and they've been hired there because they're the person who knows about this stuff the organization wants to be able to do? Okay, how was that for you? At best, it's going to be really disruptive and painful. And at worst, a lot of the time you get there, and there's all these other people who are not used to working the way you work, and they might be interested if you're lucky, or they might be hostile if you're not lucky. And it can be pretty miserable being in that situation. And if it's miserable for you, and even if it's not miserable and people are supportive of you, your ability to change that organization is really, really hard. It's very hard to change organizations. So when people try that, what happens is either that person is really, really miserable or they quit. Organizations reject change in general. And there's a very good reason for that, which I'll come to a bit later. So I'm just going to look at a little bit more detail on what it means to have a cultivation culture. So one of the points that Andrew Schaefer makes, which I think is really important, is that in a cultivation culture, we're not just building products and services and running those products and services. The output of our work is not just the systems we build, it's also knowledge. Knowledge is an output of the work we do. And the organizations we're working in should be aiming to create and grow knowledge, not just the systems we build. And in order to do that, you actually have to focus on that as a strategic goal for your organization. So, for example, 3M had this concept of 20% time, This was something that 3M came up with in the 1940s, the idea that all employees should have about 15% of their time to spend on whatever they wanted. Post-it notes came from that 15% time. And if you look at Google, Google has 20% time. Lots of organizations do this. They just give people time to work on what they want. And that's really important. That's slack time, to be able to go and research new tools and technologies, to experiment on ideas that you might have had, and then, importantly, the ability to execute on that. I mean, Kodak, for example, invented the digital camera, but then they were unable to actually make that part of their strategic goal, which is why they went bust 40 years later. It's not enough to just have that time and for people to actually be able to experiment. The organization needs to be able to take that stuff and actually strategically execute on it. So that's the other aspects of a cultivation culture. It's no good if people have these ideas and everyone just squashes them and sits on them. Pair programming and pairing in general is really important to this. I read about XP, and I read the XP book in 2002. And I kind of thought, well, this is really interesting, but that's never going to work. And there's no way I'm doing that. And then I joined ThoughtWorks in 2004, and I got put on a team where I paired with a bunch of people who were much smarter than me. And that's how I learned TDD and object-oriented programming, and actually understood it, and understood, well, to some extent, and understood why it was actually important. It was only by pairing with really smart people for about 6 months that I actually understood how to do this. Training is not the solution to this problem. Sitting someone in a classroom, getting them to read things, it doesn't give you the visceral understanding of how to do the thing. You have to actually work with people, and not alongside them. You have to actually pair with them. This is really important to actually growing new people. It doesn't scale very well, but it's the most powerful way I know to actually grow this kind of knowledge. We have to have a culture that focuses on experimentation and improvisation. And it's very easy to say that, but a lot of organizations engage in what I call risk management theater, and part of that is it's not okay to fail. Lots of organizations say, oh, we encourage innovation, we encourage experimentation, but in those organizations, if you actually experiment and it goes wrong and that has consequences, the answer is, well, actually, that's really bad for you and you shouldn't have done that. One of the things that John Allspaw says is that he's promised people in Etsy that no one will ever be fired for bringing down production, because they want to create a culture which focuses on the ability of people to try things out and not get fired if it goes wrong. You need to actually accept that if you're experimenting, it might go wrong, and you need to put things in place to manage the consequences of that. That changes the role of management. The role of management is no longer about controlling people and telling them what to do. The role of management is around creating an environment in which it's safe to learn and in which it's possible to actually experiment and improvise, and you have the resources to do that, and you have the time to do that as well. And we actually need to start measuring people on how good they are at doing this. If you have an annual review cycle, one of the things that we should be asking people is, how good a job did you do at growing the capacity of the people within the organization? If you're a technical leader, one of your primary goals is to help the people who are working for you get better at their job and learn new things. And pair with them. If they don't understand something, go sit down with them, help them understand it, show them some examples, write some code with them. That's actually really important, and we should be asking people that as part of the review process. How many blog entries did you write? How many lunch and learns did you do? These are things that we should actually be trying to measure people on. And this is not just about helping people learn. This is about growing organizations for which innovation is actually core to how they work. One of the books that I read in the last year which really inspired me was this book called Toyota Kata, by a guy called Mike Rother, who was a researcher at University of Michigan, who's studied Toyota for a number of years now. And his observation was, he'd gone and studied Toyota and looked at all the things they did, the Kanban boards and the Andon cords and all this other stuff that they had in place, and he was teaching other companies how to use it. And what he found is he would go back to the factories 10 years later, and a lot of the stuff he'd been talking about wasn't there anymore. And he said, where did it go? Where's all this stuff I've been telling other people to copy from your factory? And the people would say, well, we don't need that anymore. That was just a countermeasure to solve a particular problem. And so he felt really bad about that he'd been telling other people to do this, and now Toyota weren't doing it anymore. And so the leap that he made was actually what's different about Toyota is the management style. You can only become a manager at Toyota once you've worked on the factory floor for 10 to 15 years. And the way you learn how to be a manager, there's no training programs for managers at Toyota. The way you learn to be a manager is by learning how to do the work and by living within a culture that focuses on experimentation and improvisation, where workers are allowed to define how their processes work and are allowed to change their process to make their processes more effective. And so the job of the manager is to facilitate the people doing the work learning how to get better at it. And that's key to Toyota's ability to outcompete. One of the great quotes from, I think it was Taiichi Ohno, someone stole the blueprints to the Toyota looms, and someone asked him what he thought, and he was like, well, it doesn't matter, they can steal the looms. What they can't steal is our culture, which allows us to innovate new ideas. By the time they've got that to market, we'll have something better on the market, so it doesn't matter. Things that are not very effective at creating a collaboration culture. So classroom training, and I speak as someone, a big part of my job is classroom training. And classroom training is good at kind of giving people ideas, but it's not good at actually enabling them to effectively do them. To actually learn how to do something effectively, you have to viscerally understand why it's important and have muscle memory around it through practice. Practice is how you actually get better at something and learn how to do it really well. It's the same as sports or music or any of these other things. Everyone's read Dan Pink's book around how 10,000 hours of directed practice is what makes you really expert at something. Training is not the answer. I interviewed someone recently who was working at a company where they'd introduced Puppet, or rather he'd introduced Puppet. And the people who were working with him, they weren't really comfortable with it. They were kind of learning about how to do it. And I said, well, you want to leave this company. What's going to happen if you go back a year from now? Is that stuff going to be there? And he was like, no, probably not. And I'm like, well, why not? What are you doing to make sure that this stuff that you're putting in place is actually going to stay there? And he said, well, maybe some training. Training is not going to solve that problem. You're going to have to bring the people with you and make them understand why it's important and make it natural and a habit for them to work in this way. That's how you make things stick. Buying tools. Obviously, tools are important, and I work for a company which sells tools, but they're a necessary but insufficient condition for change. A lot of people, especially in ops, they want to do something new, they have a load of money in their budget, they spend it on tools. That's not an effective way to change. We see this, ThoughtWorks sells a project management tool called Mingle, and we have companies buy it because they want to adopt Agile, and then they start asking questions. Well, how do we customize this to our process? And they basically want to completely bastardize the tool and do really horrible things with it in order to make it fit their really horrible process. And that's their Agile adoption strategy. And we say, well, you probably shouldn't do that. That's not really a very good idea to actually be able to count to the hour exactly what everyone else is doing by making them put all the relevant information in the project management tool. Probably not the best way to proceed. Like, no, we must have this feature immediately. We're paying you $10 billion. I hate to tell you, it's not going to fix your problem. Creating a DevOps team, anyone who follows my blog will know that I'm not a big fan of this. The idea that, OK, we're going to hire all these people, and then we're going to put them in a little box, so that no one can mess with them, and so that they can then do all the clever things that will make our existing stuff work, so we don't have to change our existing stuff because that's too hard. Trying to resolve a silo problem by creating a new silo is a somewhat ironic way to actually attack this problem. So this isn't going to work either. And it should be obvious by now that hiring people is not going to solve it either, because what happens is you hire the people and they're like, oh my God, this is really horrible, I really don't want to work here, and they leave. So, the counterpart of that is if you create an organization which actually values learning and where the people actually enjoy working there because they get time to research new things and they're encouraged to experiment and they get to grow and learn new things, maybe you won't have a hiring problem. So, just saying. I think from a kind of structural level, in creating organizations that can innovate effectively, one thing that I found really interesting is this book by Nassim Taleb called Anti-Fragile, and he distinguishes between three kinds of systems. There's fragile systems which react poorly to stress. So obviously everyone's experienced the iPhone crash, dropping it gently onto a velvet pad and having it immediately disintegrate. People normally think that the opposite of a fragile system is a resilient system, systems that are designed to absorb volatility and stress. And what Nassim Taleb says is that resilience is not the opposite of fragility. The opposite of fragility is anti-fragile. And I'm sorry, this is the most disturbing picture you'll probably see the whole day. You know, when Luke Canny said, you know, we're not going to have any pictures of scantily clad people, I'm sorry, I ignored that, and now you have this. But there's a serious point behind this, which is humans are anti-fragile. If you apply stress to humans, they grow. That's why, you know, some of you may go to the gym. I don't know. This is an ops conference. You know, the reason people do this is because it makes them stronger. So this idea of applying volatility to make you stronger is actually very powerful. Now, there's a limit to this, right? If I took this and I dropped it on Arnie, he would not come out stronger, you know, except maybe in one of his films. But I think that this is something that's very important, both to us learning and to creating learning organizations. There's these kind of quotes, you know, we acquire the strength we overcome. What does not kill me makes me stronger. This is actually how you learn. The experiences that led to me writing the continuous delivery book with Dave Farley came from me working on really horrible projects where I had to do really crazy things, and I learned a ton of new stuff. Now, you don't want your whole life to be crazy and miserable. You know, I'm not suggesting we apply stress by making people work crazy hours. That's not the right thing to do. I'm suggesting we actually use a slightly different mechanism. So, for example, who's heard of game days or dirt exercises? Okay, a few of you. So a lot more of you should read about this. Game days was something that was pioneered by Jesse Robbins at Amazon, and he noted that Amazon had all these strategies for dealing with outages. And Jesse Robbins is a volunteer firefighter, and he says, well, you know, when we do firefighting, one of the things we do is we advise people on how to make their properties safe, and one of the important things is testing that, having fire drills. So we should do that for our resilience plans, for our disaster recovery plans. And so what he said is, okay, everyone, about 6 months from now, I'm going to walk into one of our data centers and power it down. And I want everyone to make sure they're going to be able to keep to their SLAs with the power off. And he actually went and did this, and everyone's like, oh no, and went away and planned how they were going to deal with this. And one day, Jesse Robbins did actually just go into the data center and power it down to see what would happen. And that's actually a really important way. It's like, you know, people taking backups and then not practicing restore, right? You know, oh, I've got lots of backups. Have you practiced the restore? Oh, no, I haven't. Well, then your backups are worthless. It's the same thing with your disaster recovery. If you don't actually practice that thing, then how can you prove that it's any good? The same thing happens at Google. They're called dirt exercises. Kripa Krishnan has written about them on ACMQ. I've got some links a bit later on, where basically they have a team who creates whole scenarios for Google. They had a scenario where there was an earthquake, and again, they give people some warning that it's going to happen probably in this week. And what they do is, you know, that they actually planned out exactly what they were going to do to simulate the earthquake. They took the whole of the Mountain View campus offline. They turned off a bunch of data centers, and they cut their fiber to Asia. And the whole organization had to maintain its SLAs in the face of those disasters. And apparently, they did a pretty good job of achieving that. One of the things that happened was when they turned off Mountain View, a lot of people had organized their failovers to fail over to boxes in Mountain View, which were then obviously not available, so the failovers didn't work. So you expose all these kind of things and these assumptions that people make that are not actually true. When they powered off the data center, they said, well, you know, we don't have enough diesel. We'd better buy some diesel. There was a process for, you know, an emergency budget process where you could just get authorization locally to buy more diesel. They couldn't call Mountain View. Mountain View was offline. There was this process so they could still buy diesel for the data center. Nobody knew about this process. Some employee bought $100,000 of diesel on his credit card. So this is a really interesting way to test your processes. And I think Netflix is one of the organizations that's really leading in terms of creating an innovation culture and a cultivation culture in particular. The Simian Army, this idea that we're actually going to create a system which is actually going to kick systems offline in an automated way is the natural extension of that process. This is how you create anti-fragile organizations. Where we actually prove that the organization can respond effectively to volatility and can actually grow in the face of volatility. But also where we create organizations where it's fun to work and we learn new things. Because if this is your goal, to be able to actually execute one of these exercises effectively, you're going to learn a ton of stuff in the process of doing that. So I guess my final point is I'm going to give you this quote from Dave Manga. When confronted with the question, are you a DevOps, I answered the only way I knew how. Someone was asking me not whether I was qualified to fill a role, but whether I believed in a movement, whether flow was of the utmost importance, whether communication was more important than silos. Of course I'm not a DevOps. Are you an agile? I think, DevOps is not an adjective that's, we shouldn't, DevOps tools, DevOps teams, hiring DevOps. What we're trying to do is change the culture of our organizations as a part of changing the game. And so that's what we should all be doing in our organizations. We're going to change the game. We need to change our culture. How are we going to create the next set of John Allspores and Tom Limoncellos and so forth? That has to be our primary goal as organizations and as people working within those organizations. How do we build the new people? How do we grow the people? So here's a bunch of resources. My presentation is going to be online a bit later on. Here's the references to Game Days and Google Dirt. Tom Limoncello did a series of blog posts on these on ACMQ. Reed Hastings' slides on Netflix culture, I think, are really interesting as well. Do we have like a couple of minutes for questions? I'm going to take that as a yes. There's people with microphones, maybe one or two questions. Stand up if you have someone up here. Sorry, I can't actually see anyone. Oh, hey.
Just a quick question. How much was your talk on culture influenced by Mike Ballmer deciding to step down today at Microsoft?
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing about the whole review process at Ballmer, that Ballmer put in place at Microsoft, where there's this idea that you're going to take the people, and every review cycle, we're going to identify this percentage of people who are the top people, the middle tier of people, and the bottom tier of people who are going to get fired, and then we're going to have fixed percentages for that. That's just, it's been known to create all these horrible problems. We need to change our HR processes to actually encourage it. But yeah, I mean, Ballmer did some really horrible anti-growth things at Microsoft. And Microsoft, I think, interestingly, is kind of more in the competence corner. Sorry, if we can get the slides back up briefly. It's more in the competence corner down here. This is what they're focused on. There's definitely, been problems in creating cultivation culture at Microsoft. But again, the other thing is that organizations, there's not just one monoculture across a whole organization. Organizations have different pockets with different cultures based on the forces that are acting within those parts of the organization, which is why, for example, ops tends to be up here, even in companies which have a different culture. One more question? Yep, someone over here. While we're waiting for the microphone to get there, I should point out, ThoughtWorks is hiring. So ironic, I know.
So in the HR space, you start to see we've moved away from, and I can't even remember what it used to be called, but now it's human resources, and now we're calling it human capital management. Awesome. The connotation almost becomes that I, as a person, am not actually valuable. I'm just a dollar to be spent. How do you propose that we help those on the other side of the fence, in the HR world, start to understand that, no, really, the people that are standing in this room, what we bring to the table is not, being in the office. It's the knowledge. It's our ability to iterate. Right. Yeah, excellent point. There's a book that was written by a Brazilian educator in the 60s called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where he talks about, it was so controversial in Brazil, he had to leave Brazil and go into exile. And the point that he makes is that our education system is focused on what he called the bank account model. They were all empty bank accounts to be filled up with knowledge. And the counterpart of that is that what we have in organizations is that the organizations treat us as kind of filled up bank accounts to be emptied. And that model, you cannot create an innovation culture with that model, because we need to, people need to grow and learn new things in order to be able to achieve the strategic goal of innovating and not going bust. So I think that's absolutely right. How do you convince people that we need to do this? Again, I think unfortunately the signals from the market, which actually cause the consequences of this kind of strategy to be exposed, are companies going bust
and everyone quitting. And those are cycles which actually take quite a long time to emerge. It might be a few years before you go bust as a result of your horrible HR policies, especially if you're selling into a growing market. That's actually very slow, and it's very difficult to change that. The slide which I didn't have time to show, which I'm now going to show, is this guy called John Cotter has a book called Leading Change, and he says, if you want to change an organization, a majority of the employees, perhaps 75% of management overall, and virtually all the top execs need to believe that considerable change is absolutely essential. He has an 8-step program for organizational change, and this is step 1. Most of the time when you change organizations, we're like, oh, we'll do some stuff over here and that'll change things. No, this has to be the case for the organization to change. So step 1, if you're going to change the way we treat people, which is vitally important, this needs to happen. That's actually the difficult bit. And so that's what you need to do. Actually doing it is really, really hard. And that's why, most companies change because they face a horrible existential crisis. The trick is creating a crisis before there's a real external crisis. And this goes back to anti-fragility. If you're constantly disrupting yourself, then you don't need to worry about the competition because you'll always beat them to it. Time's probably up, I think, isn't it? Yeah, I'm over time. So I'll be around outside afterwards. My contact details are here. Feel free to get in touch. Thanks very much for your time. Have a great day.